And as always, I worry about the state of the world order as it suspends between the past and an uncertain future. My next guest has been looking into that quite extensively. Trita Parsi is director of the Better Order Project, which has just produced a major report on, well, I'll let him summarize it, but trying to address this issue, this transitional state we're living in right now. So first of all, Trita Parsi, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's just, if you don't mind, the elevator thumbnail to get us started on the Better Order Project.
So about a year and a half ago, the Quincy Institute launched the Better Order Project, and we brought together about 130 scholars, former officials, UN officials from 40 countries to start thinking through what are the different reforms to the governing system of the world that is needed in order for it to be up to par and adjusted to the world transitioning away from unipolarity. So much of what we have is a reflection of either the post-Cold War or the post-World War II order, or after the Cold War, a unipolar setup. We're no longer in a unipolar world, but the world governing structure has not been updated to that. And the risk that we're seeing right now is that there are efforts by some countries to push for their own coalition of the willing type of orders. This is frankly what the rules-based international order led by the Biden administration is.
Right.
It's presented as if it is a defense of the post-World War II order, but in reality it's actually an instrument of revisionism that hollows out international law, in many ways is in contrast to international law, and is based on rules rather than based on law, which is a crucial difference. And our fear is that if this trend continues, we will not just move towards a multipolar world, we will move towards a multi-order world, in which we will have competing orders, which will be very different from what we had during the Cold War. During the Cold War, there were two different orders, but there was a super order above it. Both sides accepted the UN system, international law, the UN Security Council's authority. They were fighting and quibbling over interpretations of law, not over different sets of law. And that's where we may end up moving if nothing is done today, in which we actually will have competing systems of law rather than actually different interpretation of the same law. And that, in our view, would be a much more dangerous world than we are in today and that we were in during the Cold War.
And it strikes me, Trita, and it has struck me in recent years a number of times that with the two-power order of the U.S. and the USSR, it was also understood that dialogue was a part of the world order process. I've gone back and studied party platforms from the United States from 56 and 1960 and so on. And it seems to me that with the collapse of this, you mentioned the UN and the role of the UN, but also the role of substantial negotiations on nuclear weapons or now today climate, both of which you address and that you all address in this Better Order report. It seems to me that that is far less of a priority, perhaps. Well, I could speculate why, but it seems to me that one of the goals here of the Better Order Project is to restore the idea that we must reinvigorate international diplomacy to address these existential issues.
Absolutely. And I think this is part of an effort to not only rediscover the centrality of dialogue, but it's also to make sure that we rediscover and reassert the centrality of states engaging in the international system on an equal basis. Let me explain why both of these are so important. First of all, part of the reason why we no longer value dialogue the way we do is precisely because we're moving into these coalition of the willing type of setups in which we only talk to people who already agree with us. And we have less and less interaction and frank exchanges and an investment in the belief that dialogue is the most central element, tool, instrument for resolving conflicts. So for instance, at the Better Order Project, we did bring in Russians, we did bring in Chinese, former officials, people with some official capacity, precisely because it's absolutely a necessity to talk to those we disagree with in order to be able to have a peaceful world. We're not going to be able to have a stable order if we just talk to the ones that we already agree with. So that's one element. The other element that I'm frankly even more worried about, and this is very visible when it comes to the arguments that have been put forward in defense of Israel and in critique of the ICC decision, which is to say, actually, ICC does not apply to Israel because Israel is a democracy, or genocide cannot actually be undertaken if the country is a democracy. Once again, we're seeing a movement towards a hierarchy of states rather than the equality of states. And secondly, the belief that essentially there's two different sets of standards and orders. There's a set of law that applies to those whose political makeup internally is not to our liking. And then there's a different, much, much more benign, much more forgiving set of rules that are set up for those who have a domestic political construct that we are much more comfortable with. This is a recipe for absolute disaster and conflict. This will ensure that we will have far more conflicts because essentially you're telling certain states that it doesn't matter what you do, you will always be judged differently, more negatively, more harshly. And for others, because they have an organization internally that we're in favor of, we'll be forgiving to the extent that we're even forgiving or complicit in their acts of genocide. I mean, I don't think I have to explain what a dangerous
No,
world we're moving towards here.
no, of course not. And it's so critical right now. But I think there's even, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this in the context of a Better Order project. There's even a higher order sort of problem with that debate, I think, which is one either accepts the rule of law or one doesn't, period. So if I get a speeding ticket, I may think that the sheriff's deputy who issued the ticket doesn't have jurisdiction over that particular road, but ultimately I'm required to abide by what the judge decides. I can make my case to the judge. If the judge said, yes, he does, and here's your fine, I have to pay it. And I think if the world order becomes one where if you're allied with a sufficiently powerful, formerly unipowerful nation like the United States, you got to tell the judge you don't have a jurisdiction. It seems to me that's undermining not only the nature of the rules, but the idea of the rule of law itself. Do you think I'm overstating it?
No, no, I think you're absolutely right, because it's one thing for states to violate international law and norms. That's a problem, without a doubt. It's a completely different thing for them to dismiss it more or less altogether, or to argue that it simply does not apply. We have seen a systematic effort to hollow out international law and norms. We are seeing states, and this is not just Western states, we're seeing states who are taking military action against neighbors in a much, much more free way. In fact, they are modeling their behavior on the norms that the United States set up during the global war on terror. You see, for instance, how the Iranians have on numerous occasions struck Iraq with ballistic missiles, claiming that there were terrorist cells there, and as a result, they could sidestep all kinds of other norms and take military action. Israel, of course, does this constantly, bombing Lebanon, bombing Syria, etc., and not a peep out of Western countries when it does so. Turkey does so against Syria. We are moving towards a world in which we will have far greater number of middle powers. And if those middle powers start behaving using the same justifications and norms that superpowers put in place to justify their much greater maneuverability and their ability to set aside international law norms, you can just imagine the mushrooming of use of force that we will see and how much more dangerous the world will become. And all of this, at the end of the day, goes back to exactly what you said, is, are we going to have norms and laws that bind all of us and try to regulate our behavior in the international arena, make it more predictable? No one in the Better Order Project is in any way, shape, or form naive. We know very well that when push comes to shove, most states, for critical issues, vital interests, will violate international law. But most issues are not vital issues. And for those non-vital issues, they actually do follow international law. That's what ensures the ability for trade to take place without having a massive transaction cost of uncertainty. That's what increases the predictability in the regular interaction between states and minimizes the risk of conflict. We take all of that away, we are going to be in a completely anarchic environment that will be far, far more dangerous than anything we've seen.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that you and the team are not naive. I certainly agree with that assessment, but I think some people will say, and I'm sure you've had this criticism already, that it is naive to assume, especially that one and possibly two or three world powers would agree to this, starting with the United States, that it seems to me that our foreign policy of late, under both Democratic and Republican presidents, has been one of assumed impunity and from rules, norms, laws, and so on, or that we can write the rules as we go and apply them here and not there, and so on. And it seems to me that one of the biggest obstacles here, we could talk about Russia, we could talk about, you mentioned you had Russians and Chinese involved, but to me, would the United States ever agree to rules of the road like this? I think you assume correctly that this unipolar world is already crumbling, but my sense is, correct me if you think or tell me if you think I'm being too cynical, that the leadership of the United States right now, both parties, is in denial about that fact, and that's going to make it harder to get your project heard. What do you think?
So I think this is going to be a very common critique.
Mhm.
There's definitely validity in it if you look backwards towards a world in which the world either was bipolar or unipolar. And under those circumstances, yes, both of those superpowers definitely were giving themselves maneuverability and leeway that no one else could afford and no one else would be granted. And as a result, there was a lot of justification in the cynicism against this. But now imagine yourself in a world in which you actually will be in a multipolar setting, in which the United States will not have the same relative power as it did 30 years ago, in which a far larger number of countries will start behaving similar to the way the Soviet Union, the United States, or perhaps China has behaved in various contexts. That then suddenly creates a major problem for those very superpowers, because they will want to make sure that there are something binding these other powers so that they don't all start behaving in the same way as a unipolar power has done. So I think the incentive structure for even the superpowers, once we truly are in a post-unipolar world, and I think today we're in a situation in which most people recognize it intellectually, but we're not in a situation in which countries have internalized this and are acting accordingly. The entire exercise that we did in this project, it might be valuable for me to share this, is that we imagine ourselves being in the year 2040. And we imagine that the world had become undeniably post-unipolar. And we imagine that a lot of the different trends, geopolitical trends that we're seeing today will have continued apace, but it stopped short of actually causing systemic collapse. So the UN Security Council remains unreformed. As a result, is more out of sync with reality, is less relevant. US and China tensions increase, but short of war. So we're essentially positioning ourselves 5 seconds before midnight in a non-unipolar world. And we asked ourselves, in this context, how do countries' perceptions about their own interests change? And if they change, does those changes unlock flexibilities that currently we cannot muster politically? And what does those flexibilities then allow us to achieve when we take a look at many of the problems? And putting ourselves in that mindset, we produce proposals that we recognize are not necessarily politically feasible today. But if we know that we are going to end up in a world soon where those solutions will become politically feasible, then we can start working already now to prepare the political ground and space for those solutions.
And the example that comes to mind, and maybe we can close with this, as you were talking, is the Red Sea, what's currently going on with the so-called Houthis, Ansar Allah group, I think they call themselves, but it's been quite a while now, nearly a year, that they have dogged the U.S. and world shipping. I've been reading that actually cargo companies are doing fine because they've increased their profits have actually gone up as they've adjusted prices. But overall, it's been a burden on the U.S. and the countries it trades with. This, to me, seems a perfect example of this in that U.S. is attacked, can't really stop it. If you look at the chain of events, you have rebels in Yemen who are probably getting assistance from Iran, but the trigger for this was Israel's invasion of Gaza and U.S. long-term support for Israel's illegality in Gaza and the West Bank, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to me now the U.S. has gotten itself in a bind it can't get out of, and maybe this is a good example of how a differently structured world order could be of assistance even to a superpower like the US. Is that right?
Let me give you another example that perhaps is a little bit easier to wrap your head around because it has less moving parts. The one you described has plenty of them. We are right now in the United States the only country that is actually using extraterritorial financial sanctions. We've used them against Iran, we've used them against North Korea, we've used them against several different countries. People in the Treasury have long warned that the more we use them, the more unattractive we will make the dollar. And we have seen that the use of the dollar in world trade has dropped from, I think, 73% in 2000 to about 59% last year. And a key part of that is, of course, the growth of other countries such as China, et cetera, but it's also because the dollar is becoming a little bit of a risky currency in some ways because of the use of extraterritorial sanctions. Right now, the US has absolutely no interest in any regulations around this use of sanctions. But very soon, we will likely end up in a scenario in which the Chinese will also start using extraterritorial sanctions, modeling it, learning from how the US developed this tool, and start exercising it as well as a tool of national power, just as the United States has done. In that moment, rest assured, the United States will have a sudden growth in interest in regulations of these things because this will also then become dangerous to us. And that's what all of this is really about, recognizing that we're moving towards a world in which a lot of those different exceptions that the US enjoyed because of its unipolar position no longer are going to exist 15 years from now. And that will develop an interest on our end for certain regulations. I'm not saying the United States is going to turn into Switzerland or Sweden in terms of its love for international law, but it will change compared to where we have been. And it will change because it will be in our self-interest to change.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but I encourage people to read the report. Where can they find it?
Go to betterorderproject.org.
Betterorderproject.org. Well, Trita Parsi, director of the Better Order Project. It's excellent, fascinating work. I can only imagine the meetings that went into it. My heart goes out to you. So thanks so much for doing it. And thanks so much for coming on the program.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Have a good one.
We depend on your support here at the 0 Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.